To your question about AI, I have two parts. So one, on the less positive side, as you know, sort of the identification of leads in the early stage parts of drug discovery are often the shortest and least expensive compared to the clinical trials. So I don't know that AI tools used just in that way will dramatically change the success rate and pace at which drugs are delivered to patients. That being said, and then to bring it back to the joke, we now live in a world where it's possible very quickly and very easily to search the entire world of public information. And because of that, we should really not be making knowable mistakes. And it's also possible to create very credible clinical trial plans, to do very comprehensive market searches and comp searches. So there's a lot that we can do up front before we start doing any work in the labs at all.
Hundreds of thousands of researchers around the world are working to improve life and address imminent threats to humanity. Often their research ends up in the scientific valley of death in the form of publications and patents that never see the light of day. That is about to change. Welcome to the Lab to Startup podcast, hosted by Naresh Sunkara, founder and executive director of the Berkeley Postdoc Entrepreneurship Program at the University of California, Berkeley. This show has two main goals: share the stories of those who have successfully founded startups based on their own research, and highlight resources needed to help those aspiring to launch startups in the deep tech space. Whether it's electric cars, vaccines, addressing climate change concerns, or possibly establishing life on other planets, Naresh and his esteemed guests want to help scientists, engineers, faculty, and researchers bring their innovations to market. Learn more and subscribe today at labtostartup.com. And now, here's Naresh.
I have two guests today who are living inside the biotech landscape every single day, and I think their perspective is going to change how you see it. Doug Crawford is one of those rare people who has been right about the future of biotech before anyone else was paying attention. He pioneered the concept of minimum viable space, founded MBC BioLabs, and is also a managing general partner of Mission BioCapital. Doug has spent the better part of 2 decades helping scientist founders survive the valley of death. He's also a good friend, and this is his 3rd appearance on the podcast, which I think says everything about the quality of his thinking. Joining him today is Robert Blazej, a former startup founder turned venture capitalist who recently relocated to Copenhagen to lead Mission BioCapital's European expansion. Together, they operate a rare dual-engine machine, the physical lab infrastructure to build, and the venture capital to scale. There could not be a better moment to have this conversation. The landscape has violently shifted since our last macro update in 2022, when I had Doug Crawford and Rich Kelly on this pod. We have moved from the grow at all costs, zero interest rate era to a world of tight capital and high discipline. The undisputed capital of biotech in Boston is facing unprecedented lab vacancies. AI is dominating every pitch deck, and China has rapidly evolved from a manufacturing hub into a multi-billion-dollar discovery engine. And today's conversation can be considered as the 2026 State of the Union for early stage biotech, and I'm sure you'll find this very useful. All right, Doug and Robert, it's fantastic to have you both here. Thank you for taking the time to join me.
My pleasure. Great to speak with you again, Naresh.
All right, where should we start this conversation? I believe we are at a fascinating inflection point in biotech industry. The grow at all costs era is over, I think, and we have entered a period where capital efficiency, geopolitical shifts, and artificial intelligence are redefining how companies are built. I want to frame our 1 hour together today as the 2026 State of the Union for the industry, looking at where we are, how we got here, and exactly what this world order means for founders trying to build in it. Does that sound good to you guys?
That would be great.
Doug, in our last episode back in 2022, you and Rich Kelly told the wonderful story of how the two of you joined forces over 2 decades ago to build QB3 and building the biotech incubator. Then today, I want to start by exploring another pivotal partnership you and Robert, how you both came together.
Well, that is a wonderful story. Robert and I go back now more than 20 years.
Yeah, about 20 years. Yeah.
It came about at the time when we were creating our first incubator, that tiny laboratory within the QB3 Mission Bay building, Byers Hall. And who was our second resident in that facility, but no other than Robert Blazej, the stalwart, incredibly brave, yet poor co-founder of a company called Allopartis. We would occasionally sneak off to empty offices in the QB3 building, and you would share with me lessons learned from the transition as a graduate student to a CEO of a biotech startup, which were insightful and hard-won lessons that I still cling to today. You said in the academic world, you have no money, but you have lots of time. In the biotech startup world, you have no money, but no time. So you got to prioritize time over money. Otherwise, you'll never make it. So, for instance, stop pouring your own gels. Let's just get going fast. And I thought, wow, that is really, and I still think that's a deep insight for our startups in our community today. But anyway, Robert moved in, grew the technology, solved a million problems, went on to raise capital, and then sold the company to Novozymes. And then our partnership was almost slower to develop than that, though, because I would say, Robert, let's have a beer down at the ramp every 6 months or so. And I would get down on bended knee and beg him to leave Novozymes and come to our, at that point, single site, but ambitious incubator. And he refused and refused and refused and finally relented. And so now Robert and I have been intimate partners for, God, I don't know, a decade or so. Anyway,
Yeah.
that's my side of the story. Robert, what's your side of the story?
Very similar. I would add to sort of the list that I was incredibly lucky and incredibly fortunate on many dimensions. One of which was that you had started the incubator. And actually, it was funny because when I had finished graduating and I was looking for a way to teach myself how to become an entrepreneur, I went to a mixer at UCSF. And somebody said, "Oh, that guy over there, Doug, he's got an incubator down the hall." I was like, "Well, that's fine. I don't really, need an incubator. I need some lab space. I need to grow bacteria." Like, no, no, no. He's got a biotech incubator. The world has many such incubators today, but 20 years ago, that wasn't the case. And it was much, much harder to start a biotech company if you had to build out entire facilities yourself. It also meant that the ideas you could prosecute in many ways were less innovative because you had to have kind of a more mature idea. With the advent of these very fractional lab spaces where you could rent just what you need, it meant that you could really take a flyer on something that was very innovative and even fund it yourself if that was something you had to do. I was quite fortunate that Doug had created what has now become a remarkable engine for entrepreneurs to create companies. And then maybe back to one other point, I still think that innovation really requires pace. It's hard in my mind to be innovative slowly a lot of times. And I think even in this new realm where it's not grow at all costs, I still think you can't trade time for anything. You have to figure out a way to move quickly because I think you iterate more creatively with your peers, but when you're able to move quickly, and I think you have a better chance of staying ahead of competition and innovation that's happening now clearly globally.
There's one piece of the story that Robert reminded me of that your listeners would be enriched to know, which is that Robert began the company and moved into the space before he had secured venture financing. Venture financing, as we're going to talk about more today, is really a lagging indicator for innovation. It's not a leading indicator generally. And so Robert took the plunge with great courage before he had the comfort of money in the bank other than his own.
I was also very fortunate to have two excellent co-founders who did the same. And it was a matter of, working nights and weekends on other jobs to keep the bills paid, and then pursuing what became Allopartis Biotechnologies in the labs without any funding initially. And the data is really what allowed us to secure venture funding and grants, and eventually a partnership that led to the acquisition.
Wow, that's fascinating. You used to tell the story to everybody who would listen. Come, if you have a credit card and $2,000, it can open. You have some space here for working in a startup. Like, is it where it started with Robert starting without a funding?
Absolutely. Actually, all 6 of the companies that moved into that
All
first
did.
incubator had not yet been anointed with venture financing. And within the first 2 years, 4 of those companies, including Robert's, closed venture financing rounds, and the 5th was acquired by Affymetrix right out of that incubator. Starting a company is never a low-risk proposition, both personally and technically and all the rest of it. And so I think what we've tried to do is to lower the barrier between an idea and its realization in a company to a point at which you can make that leap, that courageous dive into the deep end of the pool with the $2,000 a month and start the wheel going of gathering data.
Yeah, I agree with that. I want to close the loop, which you started earlier, that you had to plead Robert to come join you. I'm trying to understand what was that shared vision or the aha moment that you realized that, okay, now we need to team up and work together.
Robert's consummate skills were self-evident to me, but he's also a very conscientious guy. So he had just sold the company to Novozymes, and Novozymes came and said, well, great, now run a site for us in San Francisco. And Robert couldn't be persuaded to leave until he had fully satisfied the implicit obligation entailed in that. But I should let Robert say that more accurately.
No, that's exactly right. I always took the meeting with you. It was very tempting many times, but yeah, I had also made commitments to my co-founders and our employees at that time, and people have many motivations for why they decide to take the risk on an early stage company, but oftentimes it's a real belief in what the company is doing. I felt an obligation to see that through to the best that I could. For Mission BioCapital, which became Mission BioCapital, and the growth of the labs, I mean, that was really taking off, Doug, when I finally sort of felt I had the freedom to come in and join you on that mission. And the growth has been remarkable. I feel very fortunate to have started my life science career with you at the original incubator, and to have to continue to advance it today, because sort of the scope and scale at which we're able to help entrepreneurs and ultimately feed this engine of innovation has really been a fantastic journey.
Speaking of growth, Doug, I was going through a conversation we had last time in 2021 for Mission Bio, and you said the startups incubated at MBC BioLabs since 2013 raised over $10 billion, brought 54 programs to the clinic and 13 approved diagnostics, and 71 products to the market. What are the numbers looking like now in 2026?
It's 21 billion, although we haven't updated that in the bits. Your intuition is probably correct. It's probably close to 24 billion.
And
and 176 clinical trials.
Wow. Isn't that fascinating?
More than 500 companies launched.
And our current residents now number 206 in 5 sites. When Robert first came aboard, it was a single site in San Francisco, and now we're 5 sites, 206 resident companies. And that number should grow to more than 260 companies by the end of this year.
Wow. Congratulations to both of you and your hard work. When you're incubating these hundreds of companies under one roof, you must have a God's eye view of the industry. Based on the founders coming through your doors today compared to 4 or 5 years ago, what does that state of the union in biotech look like right now? I mean, what are they building? And has the DNA of these founders changed over time?
I want to avoid any sense that the end is nigh for us in our industry for two reasons. First is I'm old, so I remember the 2000s turndown, which was more severe and more existential than the current one is. We should remember that this is a cyclical industry and we've had bad times before and we will have bad times again. It's just the nature of capital flows in and out of our sector. Secondly, we opened a 100,000 square foot building on May 1st. These buildings are long in the planning, and our goal was not to open a 100,000 square foot building in the middle of a downturn in our industry. But what's happened in the last 9 months since we opened the doors is we've already signed 65 leases for new companies in that space. 65 brand new companies in that building alone. And so I always joke to people who ask me, thank goodness entrepreneurs are not reading the Wall Street Journal and getting depressed before they start. The third thing I'd say is that the entrepreneurs are incredibly good at exploring novel opportunities. And so the nature of the companies being formed evolves very quickly. We'll see trends come and go very rapidly. And now I'd say that the bulk of the companies in our space, by no means exclusively, are human therapeutics oriented companies. I'd say the one unifying theme for all of our companies is that they have very bold ambitions. Maybe they have small checkbooks, but they have very bold ambitions. Robert, could you add more? Either gainsay what I've just said or add more color to it?
Yeah, I was just thinking about the question of has the DNA of the entrepreneurs changed? And I don't think it has. I mean, at the end of the day, an entrepreneur is somebody who is really driven to do something that hasn't been done before. The necessity of creating a company that's going to become venture backed. And I think that's always true. And it can be harder or easier to raise financing depending on the environment. But I don't think that changes what the entrepreneurs attempt to do. It can change the scope and scale of what they do, or at least temporarily. It also may shift how they decide to get there. Part of what you were alluding to, Doug, when there's lots of venture capital flowing, that becomes the easy and quick way to go. And that doesn't always lead to the best outcomes. I think one of the things that's great about our industry and one of the things that's beneficial about venture capital is that it forces companies to constantly subject themselves to a market check. They have to go back to venture investors from time to time and say, this is what we said we would do. This is what we got. We want to raise more money to do the next step. Have we done enough? Is it interesting enough? Is the next step worth financing? You have very little time to sit in your own space and just decide what you're doing is important. When venture is less abundant, then the companies still need to figure out a path forward, and the good entrepreneurs do. And so that may mean grants, it may mean doing earlier partnerships, but that process in itself is also a form of market check where you have to go out and get external appreciation for what you're doing. I don't think it's changed. I do think that companies have to work harder to get to the same place. But that doesn't seem to deter the best entrepreneurs.
Robert, while I have you here, I want to bring you in on the capital side. During the zero interest rate period, I was looking at PitchBook, about 309 biotech funds launched in a single year. Mega rounds flowed in early platforms on narrative alone, and valuations were like untethered to the data. And now new startup formation is down to about 70%, it seems. This is my research. From peak, and fund counts have collapsed to 46. For a founder listening now, is this a funding winter they need to survive, or is this actually the best time in a decade to start a company? What separates these companies that get funded today from the ones that don't?
I would say in the go-go times, there were deals that got done that we took a look at that we just sort of shook our head at. We couldn't understand what some of the other investors were thinking in terms of how that valuation would make sense and where the company would get to. Each venture firm has its own character. driven by its investment thesis and the people in the firm that prosecute that thesis. We've always been a firm that believes, for lack of a better way of saying it, in sort of the startup magic, that there has to be some real drive from the entrepreneur and real creativity, and scarcity of funding can create that. Sometimes if a company is overcapitalized, the pressure to really figure out something really innovative or a lean path forward that gives you optionality in the future isn't there. I would say it's a great time for investors. I think the quality of the companies that are out there is really high. It's the highest it's ever been. The science and technology keeps moving forward. The tools that we have now are remarkable. And you layer on top of that the efficiency gains of AI. I think we are making better decisions more quickly than we ever have in the past. In that sense, I think it is a great time to start a company. I think what has really suffered is the really earliest stage ideas, because venture has tended to a little bit later, more asset centric financing. So the really early stuff, even though it may be really exciting, is having a much harder time getting financed. It does put the onus on being even more lean and figuring out a way to generate the kernels of data that become convincing and then pull together a syndicate that can back that. This time, and I think we saw it coming out of previous downturns, the companies that come out of that period that survive have done it exceedingly well. And I feel that 2026, we're on the cusp of that turnaround.
If you think in the last 25-year history of early stage biotech, there are a couple of profound changes that made our growth possible. One was the ability to outsource preclinical research to high quality vendors. How do we know they're high quality? Well, they're the very same vendors that pharmaceutical companies turn to reduce their overheads.
Wuxi, yeah.
Probably the seminal version of that. But that allowed tiny little biotech companies to produce super high quality data to punch way above their weight. Okay, that was one trend. The second was one that we had a hand in, which is prior to biotech incubators, it was millions of dollars and 10 months of time to get a facility up and running to do your first experiment. Now, as Naresh said, it's a couple $1,000 in a couple of days. So that profoundly lowered physical barriers. So both data and space became way cheaper, became essentially variable costs. Okay, today we're enjoying a similar profound reduction in cost for early stage drug discovery through AI. The jury is very much out, but it should be possible now to get quality lead material that you then still need to take into the laboratory at a much lower cost. And that may allow the creation of a lot of small biotech companies that in the past couldn't have happened despite the absence of funding. What do you think about that, Robert?
Maybe I can answer it in two parts. One is with a bit of a joke. Back when I was a graduate student and things were more manual, you'd see publications that would say something like, an exhaustive genetic search was conducted to find the causative gene, or something like that. Well, what do you mean by an exhaustive search? Like, well, the graduate student became exhausted, and so we stopped. So that's the extent of what you could do. But to your question about AI, I have two parts. So one, on the less positive side, as you know, sort of the identification of leads in the early stage parts of drug discovery are often the shortest and least expensive compared to the clinical trials. So I don't know that AI tools used just in that way will dramatically change the success rate and pace at which drugs are delivered to patients. That being said, and then to bring it back to the joke, we now live in a world where it's possible very quickly and very easily to search the entire world of public information. And because of that, we should really not be making knowable mistakes. And it's also possible to create very credible clinical trial plans, to do very comprehensive market searches and comp searches. So there's a lot that we can do up front before we start doing any work in the labs at all. And I think if you strip away all the hype from AI and just focus on what it can actually do today, we should be making many, many fewer knowable mistakes. And so I think the overall efficiency of our industry is going to go up quite a lot. And back to my original focus on pace, we can do these things much faster than ever before. And we are seeing it clearly. We see it in the hundreds of companies that we have in our own labs through that God's eye view, as Naresh put it, but even more broadly, that companies are using AI at an early stage to help jumpstart what they're working on. And then if you start to apply that across the entire discovery and development process, which is what is happening, we should become a much, much more efficient industry, which will lend itself to better growth and better productivity.
I totally agree. And we need to make this point that reducing discovery costs is a small fraction of the overall cost of delivering a approved drug to market. And so we shouldn't get too excited in terms of the global reduction. But in terms of the focal point for us, which is it harder or easier to create a biotech company? It was millions of dollars to do a high throughput screen in the 2000s. Then, Dell technologies and docking technologies really helped reduce that. And it may be that we're now going for another step function reduction in that early step in the process of, hey, I've got a thesis around a target. I need chemical matter to be able to validate that thesis. We may be able to get to that chemical matter at our lab scale very fast and inexpensively. And that may allow a lot of interesting things. And this will get to undoubtedly, we're going to talk about China today. And it will be the novelty and the scope of our companies that will really distinguish them. AI may help that.
AI does require data. More and more AI companies realizing that they need proprietary data. They need data that they've generated themselves in some way. AI obviously can scale in a remarkable way. It's harder to scale labs, but in many ways, that's what our laboratories have done, making it easy, fast, and inexpensive for companies to ramp up and start generating their own data. So having something that's scalable on the lab side to help augment AI is probably an important part of that.
I can't agree more with one point you made about how people should be making less novel mistakes. I think that's a big, big take. I never thought of AI that way, but AI is such a gift. I want to stick to this early stage. One thing that popped up in my mind is how NIH funding, the non-dilutive capital for early science, it's gone down substantially. For 2026, it's about $28 billion, I think. For a founding community, that non-dilutive bridge between the lab discovery and Series A has just gotten so much narrower. What's the honest advice here from you guys? Where does that capital get replaced? And are there structural alternatives that founders aren't using and they should be?
It's hard to know the future, but I hope there's a short-term crisis around the reauthorization of the SPRR program, which is currently stalled and is causing great aggravation for biotech entrepreneurs who love that source of capital. When the Trump administration came in, there were saber rattlings around profound cuts in NIH funding, and the Congress has stood up to those, and it seems that we've stemmed that tide. But these are harder times on the academy than they have ever been before. One of the mistakes people make when they think about biotech incubators is that they're populated by 29-year-old freshly minted Ph.D.s who wear their hats backwards. And we certainly have some of those. They're great. But that only represents about a third of our community. A second third are serial entrepreneurs that thankfully exist in plentiful numbers in the Bay Area and in Boston. And the third is a really interesting one, which is mid-career scientists in the biopharmaceutical industry who get told, yeah, cool project, but it's not on our roadmap. And so then they can either retreat to their bench and keep working, or they can rent a bench from us and pursue that project. And thank goodness, many, many, many of them do the latter. The NIH is critical for long term, but I think in the short term, it won't affect the flow of innovation as much as we might think.
You brought up Boston. It used to be the undisputed capital of biotech, Kendall Square, and it seems it's facing a crisis with massive lab vacancies and R&D job losses. Is that just a localized real estate hangover?
Let me play my regional pride card and
Yes.
say, if you look at aggregate biotech venture capital as a surrogate, I'd say the Bay Area is on par with Boston, Kendall Square, the Boston area. Often Boston cites those numbers where they partition the Bay Area into several markets, and then they look like they're champions. But if you sum the Bay Area, we are essentially on par. Space-wise, it's very similar as well. I'd say these are the two dominant markets in the world. I do think that the Bay Area has been more resilient, both in all tech sectors, as it has always been over the last 40, 50, 70 years. We were all unhappily writing the obituary for San Francisco. Doom loop blogs were abound. Now you can't rent an apartment in San Francisco. That capacity to reinvent ourselves has been more of a hallmark, and I think makes us more robust. These are gross characterizations, but Boston has this incredible community of both academic but human capital coming from pharma and serial entrepreneurs, but they tend to create very well-funded, venture-backed, very grown-up companies. We get a lot more scrappy fighters that end up doing really cool things. And those scrappy fighters, as I say, are more or less indifferent to the macroeconomic trends. The other thing is the real estate index. You have to consider there was a huge boom in building that began in 2018, 2019, and came to market at just the wrong time, 22 onwards. A boom that was caused by a boom in our industry that wasn't obviously sustainable. The vacancy rates are bloated by this delivery of product into a market that didn't need that product.
It's worth mentioning in this context, 73% of pharma's revenues today are derived from programs that were sourced externally. So pharma has made this very deliberate and rational shift to externally sourced innovation for the reasons that we've been talking about. And that's not a trend that's going to change. And despite any short-term challenges, I think the need for innovation, the need for these biotech companies, ultimately desire for venture capitalists to fund them and for pharma to partner and acquire them is incredibly strong.
Speaking of innovation and something that comes up in Boston also, Doug, in our last conversation with you and Reg, we discussed alternative research institutes. Today we are seeing a fascinating A/B testing model going live. Arena Bioworks launched in Boston with $500 million to bypass academia, but shut down in under 2 years. Meanwhile, ARC Institute and Altos Labs seem to be thriving here. Looking at the autopsy of Arena alongside the success of ARC, what are the fundamental lessons here? And does it prove that patient capital from tech billionaires is a myth, unless structured with a decade-long horizon or a long-term view?
I celebrate the increase in diversity by which we're seeking innovation. In the long distant past, there was pharma and academia. Then along emerged biotech as an adventure, as the small mammals operating between these two giant beasts. I won't call them dinosaurs because that predicts extinction, but just little mammals that crawled through the forest and discovered really cool things and became very important contributors to biotech innovation. Well, now we have extended that domain of what that biotech means in our hands, but also we've added to it well-funded research institutes completely independent of academic institutions and who are pursuing very different metrics of success than the academic institutions. So the Chan Zuckerberg Institute, for instance, which is looking to underpin profound sea changes in the way we go about discovering biologic truths, is a great example of that. They say the academic world doesn't allow for the cross-disciplinary work that they thrive on. So they're filling a gap in the current academic enterprise or industry enterprise for that matter. I don't think that any particular case study portends a different future. The coming and going of that particular institute was so quick. I don't know. There could have been all sorts of forces occurring internally that I know nothing about. But I think the model of independently funded research institutes is here to stay.
To bring it back to a point I made earlier about why some people believe venture has been successful and really being an important part of innovation, not just life science, but of course, all industries, is this notion of needing to go out and talk with others, do a market check. The advice you get from others may not be right, but the process of really sort of forcing yourself to take your ideas outside and have them critically evaluated. Doug, there's a book that you and I both read called Thinking in Bets, which I would really recommend anyone read. Putting your money on the line, you actually think really, really hard about something. And so I think whether or not it's, a large, well-funded biotech company that launches with hundreds of millions of dollars or a well-funded foundation, I think both those institutions would be well served by making sure that they have a process by which they have to go out and have others critically evaluate what they're doing, not just scientifically, but commercially. For academic centers, there is so much value in basic research because it leads us in places that we would have expected. And so we have to maintain basic research for the fundamental pursuit of knowledge. But for any institution that's goal is to improve human health, I think it is essential that they have some mechanism or culture whereby they're constantly challenging themselves.
I think they're absolutely serving that space, and also the interdisciplinary aspect of research. Somehow academia didn't do a good job. That is something I never thought of, but this is a great example. I want to slightly shift gears and get into the artificial intelligence you brought up earlier. The narrative is that AI will have drug discovery time. I don't know what you guys are seeing in the pitch decks from the ground level. What is the actual impact of AI on the startups in your labs today? If there is something, where is it genuinely moving the needle?
We see companies that do have very aggressive timelines. Whether or not they actually meet them, we have to wait to see. It does feel like as soon as computation meets in vivo, things slow down to the pace that they've been at for a long time. As I said before, I think my hope is that we're making better choices by the time we get to those slower processes. And there is quite a lot of work going on to try to model cells, and perhaps in time, the in vivo side of the equation or the human trial side of the equation will accelerate. But in my mind, to be proven that we're really going to see that type of acceleration. But even if we don't, if we were to see the same pace that we have today, but a success rate that doubles, which I do think is achievable, that would be a huge gain.
There are companies for whom AI is a central pillar of their forward progress. They may even be doing new model development. And then there are lots of companies who are taking advantage of extant models, platforms to accelerate their work. What the overall effect of that will be on our companies, it's too early to tell. I remain optimistic, but we have to run the experiment over a longer period of time before we pass judgment on the net productivity gains.
Robert brought up something about data earlier. Somehow I'm a bit pessimistic on that subject in terms of, I think human biology is still to be explored a lot. If you're feeding existing data into the AI machines, are we really going to help or hurt this innovation process? I don't know, but is there one area for you guys that AI could help to fast forward all this progress?
Well, I mean, I can give a general answer just in terms of our ability now to really analyze diverse and complicated and disparate data sets. I remember writing my dissertation. It's incredibly hard for me to synthesize all the information that I wanted to put into that dissertation. And now that type of work is incredibly easy. And so I do think our ability to draw inferences across data sets is at a state where it's never been possible before. We used to have to employ armies of consultants at a prohibitively high cost in order to do that. Now that type of analysis is accessible to the earliest stage companies, which is really remarkable. Maybe that goes back to the point that Doug was making earlier about profound changes in our industry that allowed companies to do things they couldn't do before, particularly small companies.
I'm going to take a tangent here, which is when I look at the arc of discovery through to patient care, I see it's kind of like the old Monty Python. It's skinny in the end and it's skinny at the other end and it's fat in the middle. So our costs are dominated by clinical development, FDA trials. Do we see a day where the FDA says, oh, you have a model that predicts this will be safe in humans? We accept that model and greatly reduce the number of patients you need to treat. I think that day is a long way away from us, right? So instead, what we're going to have is two opportunities for profound changes in the cost and quality of patient care. One will be at the discovery end of the rainbow where we operate. Can we find new targets, new molecules? Can we do that whole discovery bit better? And I'm optimistic that will be true, but the jury is out. The other place where this could have a huge impact, but I'm not sure it will, is the world of sort of AI delivery of care to patients. So in other words, Kaiser could say, no, you don't get to see a physician until you've completed a triage or outpatient work with our AI. And then you show up in the doctor and he has basically a prescription for you. That would profoundly reduce 88% of the cost of healthcare is in labor. That would profoundly reduce the labor cost. But I'm not sure patients are ready for that. And I would remind people that for thousands of years, doctors were held in the highest regard and had very little beneficial advice for patients. And so now we have a new doctor on the block who has zero bedside manner, doesn't touch your arm and tell you you're going to be fine, but who's more accurate and vigilant and doesn't get sleepy. I don't know what the impact of that will be, but that's a place where we could have a huge impact.
I'm ready. I'm ready for an AI doctor. Mark Anderson was talking about how he had a stomach bug during travel and he sat through all night talking to AI and it responded very patiently, explaining his human body and everything, which a doctor would not do.
Exactly. We have an AI image analysis company for intraoperative validation of biopsies and then tumor margins. The same way with self-driving cars. The question always comes, well, in this circumstance, could a human do better than the AI? And sure, if you put Max Verstappen in an Uber in San Francisco and gave him a cup of coffee, would he do better? Maybe. But that's not the real world. The real world is the person texting while they drive. And I'd much rather have Waymo, who never seems to want to text anybody, concentrating vigorously than the average human. And the same will be true for medicine. At 2:00 in the morning is the radiologist who looks at your image, the world's expert, best focused? Probably not. They're tired. They're busy.
Fascinating times. I want to slightly shift gears and get into China. Let's go back to 2015 when China launched sweeping regulatory reforms, review timelines collapsed from years to months for IND applications. Drug licensing goes from almost zero cross-border activity to over a third of all global deals valued just a decade later. What's going on there? What is the actual mechanism? Is there a story about regulatory engineering or talent return, government capital? How should we think about this? And what are you thinking about this, about early stage discovery?
All of the above was a long-term, heavy capital investment by the government into a universe of super ambitious, well-educated researchers, some returnees from existing Western pharmaceutical companies and biotech companies, research enterprises, and very good business models for what to pursue. Is it what our companies do? Generally not. Generally, it's a very different business model. It's very often about variations on a known theme, combining known targets in a bispecific or re-engineering antibodies, whatever. It's a very often an incrementalism approach, whereas the companies in our space rarely, they don't have the capital to be fast followers. They have to be first in class. I would say 95% of the companies in our space are first in class. And that's a biologic risk that I think very few Chinese companies are interested in absorbing. We as patients first, and as people concerned with patients, should be extremely grateful that China has invested the money, that it's delivering on it, that pharmaceuticals are buying those assets. This is great for patient care. It does not necessarily displace or threaten the U.S. biotech industry in that we will speciate to do what we do best, which is first in class. That's my 2 cents. What the hell do I know, though?
I agree. It's a fabulous development, in part because it shows what's possible. And the FDA here will need to adapt. The FDA has a primary mission of safety. And I think as we're forced to move faster, and companies for a long time have wanted the FDA to be able to move more quickly, I think seeing China as an example of what's possible while maintaining a high safety standard will be beneficial. The US can't afford to be a place where clinical trials are not prosecuted in an efficient manner because of regulatory restrictions.
Robert, you moved to Copenhagen recently to set up your MBC's European office. In this bipolar world of US pharma, our foundational depth versus Chinese iteration speed, I would call that. Where does Europe fit in this? What is happening in the Nordics that made you set up shop there?
The Nordics are actually a really remarkable place to do life sciences, in part because you have such a concentration of researchers that really see the life sciences as both the solutions to human health and planetary health. And there's a lot of infrastructure here to support that. There's also regulatory and government support and funding for those companies. And I think what's equally exciting is that many companies, not just in the Nordics, but in Europe, see life sciences as a strategic growth opportunity. So it's a real focus of governments and policymakers to foster the life sciences. For us as well, there's a different set of opportunities that we see in Europe than we would see in the United States. And because there are different regulatory paths, sometimes you see different and more creative ways to advance companies. And we've made an investment in Europe. It's not yet publicized, but it's really an exciting opportunity. We even have companies in our portfolio, even though they're US based, will adopt a Europe first clinical strategy because it makes the most sense for those particular companies. With the rise of China, and sorry to keep bringing it back to the theme of pace, I think one knock on Europe has been a bit of lack of pace relative to the United States. Now, all companies really do need to compete on a global scale, and Europe really needs to figure out a way to have the high quality of research that it has, sort of a thoughtful approach, but then also bring in this element of speed that is really essential to be successful, particularly as you compete globally.
Fascinating.
Doug and Robert, it feels like I'm just getting started with you guys and can keep going on for a long time, but I want to be mindful of your time, especially Roberts, who's joined us late in the evening from Copenhagen. Thank you guys for being so generous with your time and insights today. You've given us an absolute masterclass on navigating the complexities of the modern biotech landscape in the early stages. The infrastructure and the capital engines you're building are doing so much more than just launching companies. They're actively paving the way for the next generation of visionary founders and finding cures. I mean, thank you for everything you're doing. Thank you for being here on the podcast.
Well, thank you, Naresh, for the invitation. You ask wonderful questions that make me think more broadly, get my nose out of the daily grind and into the broader scope. So I appreciate that.
Thank you.
It's been a lot of fun. Thank you.
All right. Good luck with everything.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Lab to Startup podcast. You can find links to the resources and programs mentioned in these episodes, connect with Naresh, or subscribe to this show at labtostartup.com.